Welcome to this episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny. Our guest this episode is Ron Elving. Ron Elving is the senior editor and correspondent on the Washington Post for National Public Radio News, where he is frequently heard as a news analyst. He also writes regularly for NPR.org. And I've described Ron a number of times as one of my regular favorite guests when I was the host of Forum for the NPR station in Northern California. Ron hosted and interviewed me on my final broadcast for KQED Radio. I've always said when I've had him as a guest that I was eager to hear what he has to say about politics, news, and current affairs on every level, and his breadth, depth, and clarity are peerless. I welcome him to Gray Matter with Michael Krasny. Good to see you.
Good to see you, Michael, and thank you for that very generous introduction. It was a great pleasure to be with you for that broadcast.
Well, and it's a great pleasure to be with you for this one. I think we have to begin by talking about what you've described as the strangest midterm election of all time, perhaps, certainly in your many years working with news, and I have to agree with that. I was thinking about what we've learned from this, and I'd like to go right to that. We've learned that maybe polls and media narratives don't work very well, or well as they should work. The efficacy of them comes under scrutiny here. But I was also thinking of a couple of other angles, and I'd like to get your response to them. I was thinking about the fact that choice and democracy and the integrity of democracy may have been looming much greater than anybody anticipated.
Yes. Exactly. And I spoke to two classes of American University students where I teach there. And on Tuesday, I had been giving them this very sage lecture about what matters in midterms and what had always called the tune. And I included in that the issue mix for this year or for any given year. That's always important. But I estimated roughly where, on the basis of all the things that I've been able to ingest over the last 6 months, where the voters seem to be getting their motivation. Was it inflation? Was it the Dobbs decision banning abortion, or at least leaving it up to the states to ban abortion? What was it that was motivating the voters, including, as you say, issues of democracy, whether or not people had gotten a bit of a taste of autocracy from Donald Trump and were, well, I hesitate to say it, but hankering for some more. And all those things, I think, were part of the mix. And as I said to my students this morning, I got the mix a little wrong. And like a chemist, that matters a great deal. I think I underestimated the significance of the registrations on behalf of Dobbs, the number of people who climbed aboard to be part of the process this year for the first time in many cases, primarily women. Most of them were women. That's data we can actually measure. But it appears that they were motivated by the Dobbs decision and by the abortion choice issue. And we saw that in the 5 states that had referenda, including California, of course, Montana, Kentucky, Vermont, and Michigan all had referenda. And all of them, whether it was a yes vote or a no vote, the one that favored abortion rights won.
There was also an underestimation, though, it seems to me, of Gen X and the role of the TikTok generation in terms of their voting, but also independents. I mean, independents came out as never before against, in favor of it, the party, and that was not the case in midterm elections habitually or characteristically.
Absolutely. You put your finger on it, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. But the other mea culpa, the other apology I had to make to my students this morning was that I underestimated the degree to which they themselves would prove me wrong. I mean, I expect all my students in the School of Public Affairs to be voters, but most of their peers, people under 30, have been notorious no-shows in midterms, and that has been the main reason for the huge drop-off in participation between presidential elections and midterm elections, and also the main explanation for why Democrats tend to do poorly in midterms, except in exceptional cases when people get motivated by something like, say, George W. Bush's war in Iraq. So the students proved me wrong. That is to say, their generational cohort did. Gen Z was very much represented, and in fact, elected the first of their number to Congress. A 25-year-old in Florida became the youngest member of Congress ever. And so that is a big factor. But to back up to your question, the other part of your question, you put your finger really on the uniqueness of this election, and that's independence. You look at the last 4 midterm elections, the last 4, whichever way it was going, whether it was a Republican midterm win or a Democratic midterm win, independents voted in the winning direction for the party that did better in that midterm election by double digits in each of those four, sometimes by 20 percentage points more. By double digits, they favored the out party, the party that was not the president's party. This time, not only was it not in double digits, but independents appear to have split almost evenly, and if anything, they were slightly more Democratic. That, as far as I can tell, and we'll do some digging here to check the data on this, but that appears to have been a unique circumstance, or certainly a rarely precedented one.
And how much of this, in your judgment, can be attributed to what you mentioned before, the fear of autocracy, or the feeling that creeping autocracy or extremism was no longer acceptable to the body politic and no longer acceptable to those citizens exercising their franchise, particularly in the sense of, well, not only Donald Trump, but the election deniers?
Yes, and the memory of January 6th, which fortunately, in my view, was kept alive by the hearings of the January 6th committee in the House of Representatives, but also I think by some elements of the media that have continued to puzzle over January 6th and wonder how that could have happened in America. The issue of whether or not people care enough about the system that we think of as democracy and have largely taken for granted all of our lives, that it was like the mountains, they were just going to be there. And I think people have come to see that there is a little more fragility there, that these aren't geographic features, that this is something that people have to pursue and make a commitment to. And I think that all of that has endured somewhat from January 6th and from all of this talk, most of which I think it's fair to say originates back to the previous president, the former president. It's not that Republicans haven't always complained about what they see as skullduggery in the Democratic venues in the big cities and so on. They've been complaining about that for a long time and looking for it for a long time and trying very hard to find it during the Bush administration, generally with no success. But Donald Trump signed on to it early and made it a big part of his whole political persona. And we're going to be digging into this further for more data to really prove it. But it appears that this election was as much a pushback on the previous president as it was on the current president. Midterms are notoriously pushbacks on the current president. That makes perfect sense. But this one seemed to have had a lot to do with pushing back on Donald Trump as well.
Well, I want to ask you about the effect this may have on the former president, but I'm also interested in finding out what you think about, well, what's been presented, not only in terms of questioning legitimacy of elections. It does go back also to the Clinton administration, notwithstanding what happened during the insurrection. The Clinton administration saying essentially that the Russians interfered, and there certainly was evidence of that. In fact, even recently, Putin's chef, as he's called, said, I did it, we did interfere, and we're going to interfere again. So there's that whole element, and the distrust and the sense of, elections not being fair, not being equitable. I mean, American people really have to suffer through this, maybe now with every election.
Perhaps so. I think with higher political consciousness, which we generally speaking think is a good thing, we like to see public engagement. We like to see voters turning out. We like to see high engagement. But with that comes a certain number of people who check in late in life, perhaps, or after a long period of time of not being checked in. And maybe they do so through media that have long since abandoned any thought of trying to be fact-based. And social media, of course, never had any pretense of being fact-based. So they get a lot of misinformation rather readily and easily and don't discriminate automatically and no longer have the services of gatekeepers, as we used to call them, people who tried to render some sort of judgment about whether or not putting something out on broadcast. We used to have the fairness doctrine and all of that, you remember. We don't have those gatekeepers so much anymore, and certainly in social media, we have not, generally speaking, had them. I know there's a controversy about who gets canceled off of Twitter and so on, and we can talk about that. But there's been a great opening of many new avenues for misinformation to reach the American voter. And the Russians demonstrated that in 2016. I think there were others besides the Russians, but that certainly the Russians did. And by the way, it should be no surprise to anyone in this country to hear Russians fessing up to it. The Mueller report, which was characterized as falsely as a vindication of the president, despite the fact that Robert Mueller himself said it was not. They were absolutely clear on the subject of whether or not there had been interference. What the role of the Trump campaign or the Trump family in that interference was left open.
So what does this mean for Donald Trump? I mean, most of the candidates, a few exceptions, that he backed did not fare well in this last election. He's already gone into a kind of embattled state with Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, and saying, in fact, that he has the goods on Ron DeSantis, things that nobody knows, all kinds of threats, presumably to crush the opposition. But now we have the Murdoch empire suggesting that maybe they're taking a counter view toward Donald Trump. I mean, the Wall Street Journal had a big editorial recently. Fox News has not necessarily been behind Trump. New York Post has talked about him as a loser. I mean, things don't exactly seem to be going his way. And he's going to announce soon, by the way, I should mention, probably he's going to announce soon that he is running again.
Well, there had been a previous announcement that on next Tuesday night, around the time he thinks election results ought to be all sewn up, at 9 p.m. Eastern time next Tuesday night, he was going to make a very important announcement, and he modestly allowed as how it might be the most important announcement in all of United States political history. So I don't think that it's going to be about, where he plans to spend the holidays. I guess he is running again. It makes perfect sense from his legal standpoint for him to announce that he's running for president. Yes, he does have to comply now with some campaign finance laws, and that's inconvenient. But it also allows him to characterize anything that is said or done about him from now on, including indictments, and there could be several, as political witch hunts. Now, he would be inclined to say that anyway, but it lends a certain amount of force if he can say, as soon as I announced, suddenly they indict me. What's that about? Isn't that a clear sign that this is politically motivated and that we have seen the Biden administration weaponize the Department of Justice?
Well, he will want to do, essentially, won't he, what Bibi Netanyahu did in Israel? That is, become the chief executive again so that he can ward off whatever forces are going to move against him and be the president of the United States, and then say to Merrick Garland, go against the president of the United States and manipulate the Department of Justice and do all of that to his own benefit.
I think that I'm not sure how the timetable is going to work here, because the sense has been for some while that if Justice were going to indict him either for January 6th and his degree of involvement in that, or failure to do anything that would have obviously been his responsibility to do, or for the Mar-a-Lago documents, that if they were going to do that, if they were going to indict him for that, they would wait until after the election, because it has always been the Justice Department's policy to wait until after elections and not appear to be torpedoing a candidate before the voters have had a chance.
Do you think if he does run, he'll run with Mrs. Malaprop, Marjorie Taylor Greene? That's the rumor. Or recently, who spoke of on Twitter, our enemies are quacking in their boots, which led to some hilarious, cartoons of ducks in boots and so forth.
Everyone needs an editor, Mike.
Well, but this is going to be someone who is, if Kevin McCarthy indeed turns out to be the head of the House of Representatives, the Speaker, then he's going to have all this division from people like that within his ranks. I mean, talk to John Boehner or Paul Ryan. They didn't exactly have an easy time of it, even when they had the majority. But I'm wondering about your sense of Trump's certainty or likelihood of his running and who he would be running with. He's not going to run with Mike Pence. And it's probably likely if Joe Biden runs, is he going to run with Kamala Harris?
There's a lot of speculative distance here and many steps there. I'm not sure Joe Biden will run again. He certainly seemed more inclined to do so in his most recent news conference after this election, because he relatively speaking, I mean, talking about other presidents in the past, you've only got to find, I mean, there are only maybe 2 or 3 who gained seats in a midterm, and always under very special circumstances, like right after 9/11 or in the depths of the Great Depression in the 1930s. I mean, just so few. And to have done as well as he did, he didn't gain seats, but if their losses are down into single digits, that's just astonishing in terms of all the expectations. So he sounded pretty chipper, and I would say more sure of himself than I've seen him since roughly the South Carolina primary in 2020.
Well, we're speculative here, but I think Joe Biden feels if Donald Trump is his Republicans nominee, he can beat Donald Trump. He did it once before. Despite his age, probably he thinks he can do it again, don't you?
And I think many sensible Republicans would say that the time when their party could win with Donald Trump has passed. The 2016 was an anomaly. It had to do with the circumstances of the time. We just had 8 years of Democratic president, and it had to do with how the country reacted to Hillary Clinton and some of her issues. So now that we've seen Donald Trump as president, and we have seen Donald Trump as former president, and we are aware of far more about the man than people knew even 6 or 7 years ago, and by we, I mean the American voting public, I think it's unlikely that he would be chosen president again, although I wouldn't rule out his getting the Republican nomination again, because that's a different proposition entirely. And that's why he's so much more focused on Ron DeSantis. That's the first issue for him. Yet, if he were somehow to defeat DeSantis and get the nomination again, that might be the Democrats' best hope, in a sense, for 2024, because otherwise, if we are still struggling as a country in terms of inflation, and if the mood of the country doesn't improve somewhat, and it's really historically sour, it would be a difficult year for Biden or any other Democrat to run. And as for the vice presidents, those are decisions I think will be made deep into 2023, and if not 2024 itself.
Is the Republican Party no longer the cult of Donald Trump then? Has that ended with this midterm election?
I am tempted to say that, Michael. I genuinely am.
That's what I was sensing, yeah, from what you were saying.
I feel as though it's that moment when you're on an airplane crossing the country and you've been flying for hours, and if you're awake, you feel just the slightest sense that the aircraft is flying differently, like it has slowed slightly. And the very next thing you think, are we descending just a little bit? And then pretty soon you hear that welcome voice of the flight attendant saying, we have begun our descent into San Francisco. And please fasten your seatbelt and make sure your seatbelt is securely fastened and, your seat is fully upright and all that. I have that feeling because I've been watching this from close up since early in 2015. And I am struck by this sense I have this week that the reaction to Donald Trump in the Republican Party has changed materially, and that more and more of the kind of Republicans who were perfectly glad to follow him up to now are no longer perfectly glad to follow him. It's not that they've had a revelation or an epiphany or that they've suddenly seen him in a new light. It's that they have seen enough to think that it would be better to do this now than to wait until later. I mean, I'm making it sound like some sort of, plot against Caesar, but they do have to get behind someone else, and they do have to begin to say it is time that we move on as a Republican Party. And this would seem to be the hour.
I like your aviation metaphor. Lots more for us to talk about, a lot of questions, but some questions coming in from those who are listening that I want to go to. Stefan Fischer begins the questioning here with something that you've heard through the years. I know Stefan is in Germany. He wants to know, from an outside perspective, the U.S. seems to be stuck in its red and blue two-party system. Could a third party with a less radical profile be a solution in a time of extremes, and what would it take?
Money. Not to be overly blunt, but in the past, attempts to organize, and by the way, there are a number of very sincere people who are trying to organize third parties in this country right now.
Liz Cheney, maybe?
She is certainly someone who would like to make herself available for a third party draft, yes. Whether or not she has the wherewithal and the impulse to attempt to do that from the ground up by herself, I think is another question. Infrastructure of all kinds, media time, et cetera, extremely expensive. And also historically, third parties don't develop in the middle. Third parties develop to the wings of the major parties. Somebody breaks off from the Republican Party and says, "You're not this enough, and I want to be more in that direction." Somebody breaks off from the Democrats and says, "You're too much corporate money, you're too establishment, you don't represent the people anymore. I'm a true progressive, and I'm going to run to your left, Ralph Nader," and so forth. We've seen this. We've seen this in the past. And generally speaking, what happens is that the party that has spawned that third party suffers from the third party's presence on the ballot as competition. I don't think that Ralph Nader, for example, in 2000 drew that many Republican voters. Some. But by and large, they were people who were more progressive than the Democratic Party or dissatisfied with Al Gore and basically from a perspective of the left. So that's been our history. And if someone can break out, and I don't want to say anything to discourage people from trying, because I think that would be a wonderful eventuality to have another option, another alternative. At the same time, now, having watched what goes on, you mentioned Israel a moment ago, coalition politics and parliamentary systems, multi-parties and so forth have a lot of attractive aspects and don't suffer from quite the same calcification as our two-party system, but they have their own problems. And sometimes those problems, for example, the inability of the various Tory parties in England to overcome the Conservative Party there, even as floundering as it has been in recent years. It isn't an automatic solution. I'd love to see the right people with the right resources try to do it.
Third parties, however, can make a difference in terms of close elections. And I was sort of wondering about the role of the Libertarian candidate in the Georgia election that's coming up December 6th, who got about 2% of the vote. That could put either candidate, Warnock or Walker, over. And traditionally, the voters who are Libertarian go for a Republican candidate. But this candidate happens to be gay, and I don't know if that makes a difference. How do you assess that?
There have been third-party candidates who, for example, in Pennsylvania, there was a third-party candidate who dropped out, was probably still on the ballot, but announced that he was no longer running and wanted everybody to vote for John Fetterman. Because with whatever concerns people may have about his health, John Fetterman was so much closer to this third-party candidate's view of the world that he did not want to be a cause for people to, he did not want to have his candidacy hurt Fetterman and help Mehmet Oz. So he dropped out and endorsed Fetterman. I would hazard the guess that if the Libertarian candidate in Georgia were to make a move of that kind on behalf of Raphael Warnock, the Reverend Warnock, that would make a difference a little bit. If some Libertarians came over to vote for him in the runoff, that would be beneficial. On the other hand, I'm not sure how many of his voters, the Libertarian voters of Georgia, are going to be available to either of the candidates in the runoff.
Jim Keppel from Cincinnati says, do you think the polls might have themselves affected the election by giving Republicans a sense of comfort and Democrats a sense of worry? Could they have affected turnout enough to affect some close outcomes?
My sense is that the times when polls matter the most is when polls lull people into not voting. I'm not convinced that Republicans suffered in this election because their base voters, their committed voters, did not turn out. Now, we're going to find out. I mean, that's the sort of thing that serious social research can get at in the time between elections. And I distinguish between serious social scientific polls on the one hand, which are done for the purpose of learning and knowing, as opposed to most political polls, which are done either to sell media or to influence people or to please candidates or to try to influence voters in that sense. That's a little different. I'm saying it's illegitimate. I doubt that it's as accurate. But there are some serious academic pollsters who can tell us more things in the interim between elections than we know before elections. And so I try to pay as little attention to polls as possible. I try to stay off 538.com. I try to stay away from compilations of polling and so on. Of course, I can't entirely. I mean, I can't divorce myself from it entirely, but it does seep in, and it does influence how you think about an election. I would hazard the guess, and I don't think this is entirely a guess, that a lot of people stayed home in 2016. They weren't crazy about Hillary Clinton, and they assumed from everything they had seen in polling that there was no chance in the world that Donald Trump was going to win their state or win nationally, and so they didn't bestir themselves.
Question from Eric Billings in Washington, D.C. He wants to know, as a media professional and having seen the recent trends in misinformation propagation, which you alluded to before, do you think there is need or room for additional regulation of media, social and traditional formats, or is that slope too slippery?
It's terribly slippery. And as soon as you start having the government be involved in regulating the media, not that it hasn't been in the past. As I mentioned earlier, we've had things like the fairness doctrine and what have you, equal time provisions on broadcast outlets because they use the public airwaves. That's a government regulation, to be sure. I don't think that era was worse than now. I think it had its flaws, but I also would hold that people got more reliable information by the most mass media of a generation or two ago when there was a little bit more regulation, and that the completely unfettered nature of social media, where people can say anything, do anything, be Russian bots and impersonate Americans who were, good flag-waving Texan, truck drivers and so forth. I don't think that helps us. I think that's not, free speech. I think it's deceit. And insofar as it is possible, and it's going to have to be done gingerly, but insofar as it's possible to regulate that kind of activity so as to eliminate deceit, as opposed to, political opinions that you don't happen to hold yourself, I think it might be worth pursuing. I think it might be worth having another look at it in the spirit of the way it was done, starting back with the original Broadcast Act in the 1920s.
Well, that brings me actually to an article you wrote, which I read with great interest. It was in npr.org, and it was all about, you began by Diogenes, carrying the light, and you went into the difference really between facts and what is at least estimated or assumed to be truth. We need more facts, although the Moynihan quote came quickly to my mind about facts versus opinions. But when you have someone like Kellyanne Conway talking about alternate facts and so forth, you have a world that's really, in fact, I think you were saying this is maybe the real question of our time. How do we wed ourselves to facts as opposed to all of the false fake news that's out there and all of the opinions that are out there that mean so little?
One thing that, again, would hark us back somewhat to the past, and which the social media were exempt from, was the responsibility that people have to their fellow citizens that could lead to them being sued. And if you can't be sued for anything that appears on your platform, no matter what, that does tend to encourage not only the platform provider, but also the people who use it to think that anything goes, because it would appear that anything does. So if there's no penalty for complete fiction, totally making things up, abusive misuse of the media, I think we can assume that there will be such. And this does tie back to what we were talking about with Russian interference. A lot of that was a portrayal of an alternative reality that was simply and frankly fictional. It was simply being invented. So if someone can do that, and there's absolutely no way for current regulations to prevent it or to to restrain it. I think that's an abuse that we need to look at. And I know there have been some thoughtful people, both in the media and in academia and perhaps even in politics, who have been trying to do just that.
Well, Alex Jones was brought to a sense of justice in a big way in his pocketbook.
That's right, because the legal system was open to him. It was available to him. It was possible for the people he had harmed to actually hold him to account. And here again, to some degree, that is a function of which medium you're using. That people do have responsibilities for what they put out on public airwaves. And that's part of it. Also, that people could show the harm that was done by his specific falsehoods. So, insofar as that can be a more generalized lesson to people who practice what Alex Jones has practiced, that I think is a good thing.
Our guest on Gray Matter with Michael Krasny is Ron Elving of National Public Radio. And one of our first podcasts was with Larry Diamond, expert from Hoover Institution on democracy, and we talked a lot about ranked choice. And David Barton from Memphis, Tennessee wants to know what you, Ron, think about ranked choice voting and its chance to be implemented. Larry Diamond is a big advocate of it.
Yes, well, I'm glad to hear that. And he's familiar with voting systems all over the world, of course. That's part of his expertise. I have to admit, I am more than modestly hopeful about ranked choice voting. I think it's going to be a tough sell because it is a little complicated. It's not rocket science. It's not nearly as complicated as the signal system that baseball teams use to tell batters and pitchers and so forth what the manager wants them to do. It takes a little bit of doing and a little bit of thought. But my experience is once people have got it, and it doesn't take nearly as long as figuring out how to do most of the things people learn to do on computers, they realize that it's empowering. It's empowering for your vote to survive your first choice. So if there are 5 candidates and you can choose among the 5, you can choose 3 or 4, whichever the system chooses to make it a pick 3, a pick 4, whichever, and rank them. Not just say all those are acceptable to me, but to say that's my favorite and this other one over here, this is the one that would disturb me most to see in office. I think we can all go back over elections that we've seen, particularly in the primaries, and imagine times that would have been very handy. Now, I haven't seen the final results, and there's, they have to go through the ranked choice system in Alaska. But I think the general consensus up there is that without it, Sarah Palin would be on her way to Congress right now because she would have won the Republican primary way back last spring. Instead, she had to go through the ranked choice voting and then a runoff and did not win and did not have the most second place votes. And so she is still a private citizen in Alaska, and I don't know the results yet. No one does yet of what happened in Alaska this week. But I think people in Alaska would be quite shocked if Sarah Palin came out of this round of voting as their new congresswoman. Now, I will admit I was not a great admirer of her political career up to now. And I think that is a demonstration of how people in Alaska didn't get stuck with her again, which under the old system, that was operative when she was first in politics, or that's operative in most of America, she would be right now on her way to Congress.
There are some who think that McCain lost because of her. Are you one of those?
I sat.
Or that he started losing ground tremendously because of the choice of hers as running mate.
I heard so many people that summer, 2008, say, oh, this is the savior of John McCain. I mean, he was so dull and I wasn't interested in it. But now, boy, he's got that rip-roaring, fantastic Sarah. And her crowds that fall were far larger than his. And so there was that element of that choice that was, in a sense, brilliant because it put him in the running at a time when it appeared he wouldn't be. But then, of course, we had the collapse of Lehman Brothers and we had the Wall Street seizing up and credit markets seizing up, Wall Street collapsing. That whole mortgage crisis put such an emphasis on competence and electing people who were more than great rally speakers. And at that point, of course, we started learning more about just how ill-prepared she was. And And in that sense, I think she probably finished him with some voters. And there were so many other things going on in 2008. But I remember sitting at a lunch some while after here in Washington and having a couple of people from the military tell me that they had never voted Democratic in their life, that they had no use for Barack Obama, but that they could not stand the idea of serving in the United States Armed Forces in uniform under a President Palin. That they just thought that was, now maybe that was sexism on their part, I don't know, but they seemed to be quite offended that McCain, whom they admired greatly, had chosen somebody so ill-prepared to be commander-in-chief. And they were talking strictly in terms of national security.
McCain called, Donald Trump called McCain a loser because he was a POW. That somehow equated in President Trump's mind with being a loser. Now, Kari Lake has taken from Arizona. I don't know how that's going to turn out. We're doing this now before we know the actual outcome of that race. But she went into not only election denial, but also statements along those lines about McCain being a loser, when at one time she was a tremendous admirer of McCain's. I only bring this up because it just seems to show kind of the chameleon nature of certain politicians and how they can shift in ways that are almost utterly unpredictable. Simply can't in any way imagine. I want to get to something else, though, that has always kind of something I've always wanted to ask you because you're such a seasoned veteran with these things, and that is, we've been talking in the last election, in the midterm election, about forces on the ground and door to door and who could mount the best campaigns and so forth. And it seems to me that the Democrats really showed that they have those kind of strengths, maybe even more than the Republicans. On the other hand, the Republicans have been pretty deft and able at gerrymandering, which also played a role in this election and plays a role in all elections. Is that a little bit too simplistic of a binary? The Republicans are better at gerrymandering and Democrats are better at getting the forces out there?
There is some truth in that, but I would say you have to look at it state by state. For example, most of the people I've talked to about what happened in Florida this weekend, by the way, that's where the red wave was. They won everything in Florida. They won all the really contested, desirable races, governor, senator, several congressional seats that were contested. The Democratic Party...
surprisingly, New York even had a bit of a red wave.
Well, and I was about to say, that's the other part of your question about gerrymandering, in that the Democrats had controlled the map drawing process in New York with all the levers being in Democratic hands. They drew a very aggressive map that almost abolished the Republican Party in terms of seats in Congress. And a judge there threw it out and said, this is obviously abusive. I personally think all judges should take that view, and the Supreme Court should long ago have taken seriously partisan gerrymandering the way they took seriously racial gerrymandering. Took until the 1960s, but they did it, and we've had proscriptions against that since. But the Supreme Court doesn't want to touch partisan gerrymandering, and by and large, most courts have not. But this judge did, and he threw out the Democrats' map, and he said, "I'll draw you a fairer map," and he did so. And as a result, the Republicans have picked up 3 to 4 seats in New York, one in Hudson Valley, one more outstate, 2 or 3 more outstate, where there's always been a lot of Republican territory, always. But you draw the map to either minimize that Republican territory or maximize it. And this map made it possible for the Republicans to pick up 3 or 4 seats in New York. They're going to pick up some seats in California. And irony of ironies, their majority, which will be small in the new House, is going to be dependent on those seats they picked up in New York and California.
And a question from one of our listeners, Reed Maidenberg, he says, Ron, I alluded to this before, and he asked directly, what do you make of Murdoch breaking up with Trump, and what effect may that have on any potential presidential run?
I don't often quote Michael Wolff, the magazine writer who wrote several books about Donald Trump, but he has a relationship with Rupert Murdoch and was a biographer of Murdoch's, and Murdoch talks to him, and some of the others in that family do. And in his last book about Donald Trump's presidency, I think he called it landslide, he tells an extraordinarily interesting anecdote, which of course I can't confirm, but in that anecdote, Trump has everyone he knows on election night 2020 calling the Murdochs. So every member of his family, Donald Jr. and Ivanka and everyone is out there making calls. And somebody finally gets through to Lachlan or someone who can get the man on the phone. And they finally get Rupert all the way into the hands of one of the top Trump people, maybe a family member. And a family member lays it out and says, you've got to get Fox News to recall, to rescind their call of Arizona, because that's messed up our whole little plan here. It's going to keep us from claiming that we've got the election, that we won. And this is like midnight. And they've got all these people waiting in the ballroom, to party. And Murdoch says, well, I won't say what Murdoch is quoted as saying, but I think we all can imagine his expression. But in a very, very, very pithy way, he says no. And at that moment, and I think since then, there has been the beginning of a real distinction between at least the Fox and the premier properties of the Murdoch empire and their attitude towards Trump. Not that they turned against him. We're seeing that a little bit more now. But the Wall Street Journal started to write editorials that were hostile. They wrote a very tough editorial after the January 6th committee ended. And New York Post will make fun of anyone. And now Trumpty Dumpty, everyone's seen the cartoon. That is a sea change that is becoming more apparent all the time. It started a while ago, and it is just manifesting itself more openly all the time. The big beneficiary of this in the short run is, of course, Ron DeSantis. And I mentioned that Florida was the red wave of this election. A part of that is being blamed on the Democratic Party not having done what you said is supposedly their stronger suit. Getting out the vote, being, out there on the ground. They also, I don't think, did a very good job in Florida of defending the people that they were running against spurious attacks they were getting from all directions, or countering some of the absolutely overwhelming Spanish language advertising that was done in South Florida, making the essential issue of 2022 socialism. And many of these folks, of course, are from either Cuba or Venezuela or have relatives who live there, and they are highly responsive to that anti-socialism message. Ron DeSantis carried Miami-Dade. He didn't just hold down the Democratic margin there. He carried it. And that has to be terribly frightening to Democrats in all parts of the country where there is a substantial Hispanic vote. Florida has never been like California in terms of that vote, but there is a very serious effort being made by the Republican Party to do better in terms of Spanish language radio, in terms of Spanish language literature, to find issues to appeal to all different kinds of Latino, Hispanic, Spanish-speaking, Spanish heritage voters, and that's something Democrats did not respond to well in Florida and need to better wherever it's relevant.
Well, even when you go back to the second President Bush, he was trying to make all those inroads, but doing it with the Hispanic population, but doing it largely through immigration and through acceptance and so forth. And what has always struck me, and particularly in this midterm election, is how the Republicans have managed to not only become identified with immigration control and doing better with the number of migrants getting into the country, at least identified in some way through the media and through the public, and also becoming identified as doing better somehow with the economy and doing better somehow with just a number of issues that we could, inflation as part of the economy, but also big issues like crime. The economic side of that has been really, just in terms of fact crunch, disproven. Recently, I interviewed David Rothkopf, and he did an article about this. And look at GDP, look at just the numbers, crunching the numbers, and so forth. but there's a sense of disbelief in those numbers. Again, we get back to your article about facts versus truth and so forth. I was a little surprised in Florida, by the way, that Val Demings didn't do better than she did, too.
There you have it. I mean, there were real questions about the candidate the Democrats nominated against Ron DeSantis. That was Charlie Crist, who used to be governor of Florida at one time, but he was a Republican at the time. He was actually a serious consideree for vice president back during the presidency of George W. Bush. His name came up during the 2008 search for candidates. It's hard to believe, isn't it? But that he's been through quite a transformation. He served in the House as a Democrat. His congressional seat went Republican on Tuesday. I don't think it's terribly surprising that he was not successful against DeSantis, but I was surprised Val Demings did not do better against Rubio. But here again, there was a tremendous mobilization on behalf of Spanish-speaking voters or people with a Spanish heritage. And there also was not an effective counter on the part of the Democrats to get out a larger vote among African Americans and among Democrats of all kinds in Florida. It's, Florida is a little like Texas and California in that there's many states in one. And whether you're talking about one part of Florida or another part of Florida, you're talking about very different places. But you do have to deal with the map as drawn. And the Democrats don't seem to have had a strategy for their campaign in that state in 2022. And that's something that needs to be addressed. You hear people saying, well, if we're not going to be able to do better in Florida, we're just not going to send any resources down there at all. We're going to write it off the way we used to write off Texas. And that's not a winning national strategy.
Question from Talala Lopez Waterman in Honolulu, Hawaii. He wants to know, how do we reinvigorate discourse between divided political views in our country?
That is,
talk about the big questions, Ron. Huh?
Yes. With
all of your wisdom,
thoughtful questions.
And we thank the questioners here. By the way, we always get very good, thoughtful questions. We're spoiled that way.
I'm not surprised. I would say the best way to start is just start. Try to find someone that you don't talk to because you have said to yourself, I really don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear any more from that person. And we all have such friends or acquaintances, at least, and certainly family members whom we have sort of held at arm's length or said, oh, we've agreed not to talk about politics with Uncle Earl, what have you. We've all got those relationships. And that is a luxury. That's a luxury of good times. And in hard times, in difficult times, and I think we're going to see in our public life some hard times, we need to address that. We need to say, all right, I'm going to sit down with Uncle Earl. And I'm going to try to find some way or another to find something that we can agree on. Even if it's only tangentially political. Just try to find something we can agree on. Understand his framework. Understand where he's coming from. It's not fun. I got to tell you, I've never enjoyed doing this, and because I've been in the media, it attracts a certain, as you well know, it attracts a certain number of people who want to take you on, and it's not my favorite part of the job. At the same time, I think that's what we need to do, because after you've really listened to people, they regard you differently. And as a journalist, you know this, that if you've really given someone a hearing, they regard you differently from what they might have before. And,
yeah, I think that's true.
And that's what we need to start with. And everyone needs to do it on their own personal level. I don't think you can say, all right, from now on, everyone in America engage in more civil discourse, or let's all be more understanding of other points of view. You have to just practice it and try to spread it.
Well, it's what certainly journalists like you and I have tried to do and believed in, I might say ardently, fervently. One of the problems, though, that we face now is there's so much asperity, there's so much animus and venom out there. And I'm not only talking about social media, I'm talking about people who are public health officials, getting needing security like Fauci did, and all the way down the line. People on school boards needing security, children in schools needing security. I mean, we're in a different world now. You were talking about the best generation before. This is, I don't want to sound too much of an alarm here, but or sound too pessimistic or down, but this is our reality, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And I do think it's different. I don't think we're just, changing our perspective on it. I think it is materially different, and it is a threat to living the way we have been privileged to live in this country, which is that we can engage in politics. We're free to engage in politics, but we're not visited by politics pounding on our front door in the middle of the night. We don't have that kind of intrusion, most of us.
Unless you're the husband of Nancy Pelosi.
Well, and I was going to say at some point, Michael, it's just very disheartening to think that not only that this should happen, of course, the crime here is the worst thing, but it's also disheartening to note how few people who should have taken this as an opportunity to say, let's lower the temperature. Let's back off of this abuse of this one particular politician, Nancy Pelosi, who there's a cottage industry of Nancy Pelosi hate. I get scores of email contacts, and unbidden. I'm just on lists, and so I get things from Republicans running for office, Democrats running for office, mostly Republicans, it seems, and I know I'm on a list because they think my first name is Elving, so everything's addressed to Dear Elving, and we're counting on you, Elving, and you've always been one of our most reliable, and I've never given $1 to a politician in my life. So, this is list stuff. And I was hoping that some of that would at least ease around the time of the attack on Paul Pelosi, that there would be less vituperation in personal terms of Nancy Pelosi. That did not happen. And of course, we had, Marjorie Taylor Greene loudly proclaiming that the only time Democrats ever care about crime is if it's an attack on Nancy Pelosi's husband. That is disheartening.
So tell me what's heartening. What gives you hope at this point?
My students. Not just my students. The reason I say my students is because I don't naturally have a lot of other opportunity to meet Gen Z people. Even my daughter is older, and she regards those people as kids. So it's great that I have an opportunity. It's a real privilege to be able to get up in front of 50 young people, hopefully in smaller groups than that, and hear from them. And that's why when I went to class this morning, I wanted to say I'm sorry. I underestimated your generation. I knew you all voted. I didn't require them to vote in terms of their grade, but I made sure they all had contacted the people back home and were sure there'd be voters this fall. But I had underestimated their cohort, and I apologize to them for that. I have a lot of respect for these young people, and they hearten me every time I'm with them because they seem to have the best of what America's heritage is. And I think they're already much better at the melting pot than any other American generation has ever been. And they're much more open and accepting of differences between people. And so my hope is that the younger people are going to do better.
Yeah, I share that hope as a teacher of young people for many, many years, and still doing it at your alma mater, Stanford, but taught all those years at San Francisco State. Apropos of that, here's a question. We thank Chris Clark for his question. He wants to know, is one of our lessons learned, I assume Chris is talking about the midterms, that the pundit and polling class should include younger participants who may be less seasoned but more in touch with their cohorts? Right on line with what you were saying.
Yes, yes, and the answer to that is yes. I hope that it's safe to say that we at NPR are doing more and more of that. We have a new generation of hosts on our programs. I'm sometimes amazed myself in listening to NPR at how young everybody sounds. Because, I'm from the, Robert Siegel, Linda Wertheimer, Cookie Roberts generation. And of course...
You're kind of the last of the Mohicans in some ways.
Well, Susan Stamberg is still around, and she, of course, is the mother of us all in a very real sense. But you know what I'm saying, that when I came to NPR, I still felt like I was a younger member of the Mohicans. And so, and I miss, of course, those individual people very much. And I would say everyone, has a certain fondness for their own generation. But I think we are doing what we need to do, which is turning the mics over to very much younger people, not just people in their 40s, but people in their 20s and 30s.
Here's Reed from Santa Rosa. Maybe a final question. He wants to know, is Trump above the law?
No, Trump is not above the law. And I think that gradually, and I think it's all right in a sense that our system is hesitant to prosecute a former president or a president in office, which, at least that's the official position of the Department of Justice. You can't do it. But even a former president of the United States, I don't think we want to see the prosecution willy-nilly of politicians who have fallen from grace, because it's always going to look as though they're being punished for having been in politics and having had different views. When there is a specific and clear case of criminality, and I would say particularly if it's divorced from their time in office, they cannot be given a pass. And once they've left office, as with, others in the past, they need to be taken before the bar of justice. I mean, Richard Nixon was given a pardon instead of a trial. And I think that I can understand why Gerald Ford felt the way he did, but I think that was a mistake. I think we should have held Richard Nixon responsible for leading a criminal conspiracy. And if that is the case with Donald Trump, then I think he should be held responsible for that as well.
It brings up another ancillary question, though, and that is the Republicans were talking when they were expecting the red wave that they would indeed impeach Joe Biden. They would also bring his son to justice. Those were, as far as I could determine, major wish list that they had. Now it's going to be a pretty small majority if it indeed turns out to be a majority. And there's still a possibility, while we're talking now, unlikely, but a possibility that the Democrats could eke out still a small majority. But if the Republicans have the majority as expected or anticipated, do you see those things moving forward in any way?
It would seem unlikely that a party with that little margin for error would expend its political capital in that way. Some people think that there are 5 or 6 or 7 Republicans, and we could throw in some names that are so aggressive about their partisanship that they will insist on it. And if Kevin McCarthy or whomever wants their votes for speaker, they will say, that's the price, Kevin. I'm not voting for anybody who's not willing to give me a date when the impeachment process will begin against Joe Biden. That has been speculated. I'm not so sure. My guess is they've got fewer than 225 seats. They're going to want to march a little more carefully, and that they're not going to want to be gone in 2 years as the majority party. And impeachment has almost always been unpopular. Certainly was very unpopular when they did it to Bill Clinton. So unless they have something no one is aware of with regard to Joe Biden, any move in that direction, I think, would be a major loser for them. And so cooler heads, I suspect, will prevail.
It wasn't necessarily unpopular to the Democrats, though, when it occurred twice with Donald Trump, though, was it?
Well, some Democrats, obviously Democrats in general were in favor of those impeachments. Some would have impeached him for what was in the Mueller report, for that matter, even though it was inconclusive in some respects. He clearly, there's evidence in the Mueller report that he clearly obstructed justice in terms of that pursuit, in terms of the Russian connection. So Among partisan Democrats, popular, yes. Among many people in the House, certainly it was an absolute imperative. Still, Nancy Pelosi resisted it until she absolutely couldn't, until he broke the law so openly and brazenly that she couldn't. And the second time, of course, after January 6th, that is an entirely a different matter. Still, having said all that, I don't think the country as a whole liked, especially the first impeachment of Donald Trump. If it had been more in favor of that, the Senate would have felt more pressure to convict, and he himself would not have been able to do as well as he did. I mean, as even losing, he did get more votes to be reelected than any other incumbent president in the past. He just happened to lose to the other guy by another 7 million votes. But it wasn't as though he had been rejected massively by the voters, or there was a sense that impeachment alone, had failed to get him, and that the voters needed to do it. It was, I think, a less than totally popular move for the Democrats to make the first time. And I don't disapprove of Speaker Pelosi's decision to do it, because she's responsible first and foremost to her own membership. But I think she always knew that it was going to be an enormous expenditure of political capital, and it probably ultimately would be futile.
And as I said, always a delight to talk with you, always enlightening. Your students are very fortunate to have you. You're a natural-born teacher, and many thanks for being with us, and many kind thanks for those of you who are with us for this episode live, and those of you who will be watching this episode in the future. And a reminder to you, all of you, that if you like what you are experiencing here on Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, we invite you to join this unique and ever-expanding community of ours and become members. Simply go to graymatter.show, and I want to thank all, not only who joined us and will be joining us, but also thanks to our remarkable team, to Alex and Shannon and Colin and Chad, and special thanks to Ron Elving of National Public Radio. For all of us, I'm Michael Krasny.
Bandwidth for Gray Matter is provided by CashFly at CACHEFLY.com.